the concept of degrees of freedom and constraints. For example, in 3 dimensions, X, Y, and Z, if there are no constraints imposed, one has perfect mobility in all 3 dimensions, both in the plane and also vertically. If you impose one constraint, you are no longer free to move in 3 dimensions. You will be limited to a surface. So for example, if the constraint is Z equals 0, you're no longer in 3 dimensions, you're now down to 2 dimensions. If you impose a second constraint, you are now forced to move along a line. You're now moving in 1 dimension. If you impose a third constraint on that system, there's only one solution, there's one point. And if you put in a fourth constraint, when you only have 3 degrees of freedom, there's no solution. That's one way to think about a situation that may seem to be hopeless or impossible. I'll give you an example. Public higher education in America is generally regarded as being dysfunctional, despite the fact that America spends more dollars per student than virtually any other society in the history of the world. Yet, when they do comparisons of test scores for students from the US and other countries, the US leads in virtually nothing. In terms of science and mathematics and so on, many of the countries of the world do much better. That leads inexorably to the conclusion, with all that money spent, with all the advantages that America can offer in terms of technology and so on, how is it that the public schools are failing? Well, the people who talk about that sort of thing invariably talk about the constraints. In many states, we have teacher unions, which limit the ability of the schools to do what they might like. There's a requirement that schools operate only in the time of year other than summer. That's actually an artifact to an era 100 years ago when everybody worked on farms and you needed students to come home and work. So right now, I think 3% of the workers in America work on a farm, and yet we haven't gone back to change it. So if you look at that situation and think, there are just too many constraints and this problem cannot be solved, let me tell you, it is sometimes possible, when you can't remove the constraints, you can add a degree of freedom which you didn't have before. Now in mathematics, you can't do that, okay? You can't suddenly say that in 3-dimensional space we're going to add a 4th dimension. Well, maybe you could. Science fiction is predicated on such things. But it is actually possible, and the best example I can give you of a situation that seemed hopeless, it was hopelessly constrained, and there was no solution. A solution was found that added a degree of freedom. And I'm talking about an elementary school in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, called the A.B. Holmes School. This was a school where 11 different languages were spoken in this school. Many of the families were immigrants from various countries of the world. The school was failing in virtually every measure of performance in elementary school. The truancy, students not coming to class, students getting into trouble, being sent to the principal's office. So every measure of distress went off scale, and then every measure of success was very, very poor in terms of their test scores. This school was functioning so poorly that they were given 1 week to come up with a different model or they would be shut down. And the principal, her name was Muriel Summers, got together with her teachers and they came up with a plan that was approved, and the plan was basically to teach character education to the students, in particular, Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The teachers learned the 7 habits, the janitors learned it, the people who worked in food service learned it, and they taught it to all of the students. And in a very short period of time, this school that was on the verge of being closed because it was unsuccessful suddenly was achieving incredible test scores, all kinds of success. When I look at that, I'm convinced that the 7 Habits training, as applied to elementary school students, added a degree of freedom that didn't exist before, because they removed none of the constraints. they still had students who spoke 11 different languages. Well, you can't say that's constraint if, in fact, they were successful in spite of it. You know what I'm saying? So that development gave me great hope, and I'll tell you why. I've been the president of California University for 20 years. I'm completing my 20th year in August of this year. And until very recently, I had a big secret that I couldn't talk about. I was embarrassed that my university, which has a college of education, we've been producing teachers for 160 years. Our university started in 1852. We've been producing teachers for 160 years. And yet, we were not contributing to the change that was needed in public school education in our country. And I didn't know what the solution was. I focused on all the constraints. If the schools were really designed to serve the students, you wouldn't put the union contract first, right? You wouldn't put the teachers first. You'd put the teachers second. You'd put the students first. But that's the way we were aligned. So I was basically trapped in my own thinking. I was embarrassed that our university, we produce great teachers, they're in demand, but we weren't changing the fundamental problem. And it wasn't until I saw what happened at A.B. Combs that I finally realized that it is possible to add a degree of freedom that didn't exist before. So at our university, just in the last year, we introduced something called Leader for Life. You may know leadership has been defined many different ways, but the definition that I prefer is this one. Leadership is conveying to people their worth and potential so clearly that they are inspired to see it in themselves. Now that's not the leadership that I was taught. When I was in high school, there was an election for the president of the senior class. And a friend of mine, Franny Santilla, was elected president of the senior class. And every other student, I know I did, sat back and said, well, there was one leadership position, that's not me, so I'll just sit back and wait to see what Franny does. Okay? All these years later, he still organizes our reunions. Okay? So that model of leadership, I believe, is archaic. The new model of leadership is not that it is a position, it's a choice. If you think about that definition, anybody and everybody can be a leader if you can convey to people their worth and potential so clearly that they're inspired to see it in themselves. You will become a leader. If you think back to your lives, I'm sure there were people, could have been parents, teachers, friends of the family, people that you work for, who inspired you by showing that they had confidence in you. Anybody is capable of that. And I believe that's the kind of leadership that the world needs today. And that kind of leadership can come from not just the top person at the top of the organization, it can come from every person in the organization. Okay, so I've given you the punchline in advance. Principles and degrees of freedom. The final statement is this. I believe that principles, when you revisit them, principles will point the way to how you find the additional degrees of freedom to solve any problem that you may be facing, whether it's personal, educational, corporate, or even as a country, diplomatically speaking. That's my assertion. And Ron, what do you think? Why don't you comment now that you've heard my opinion? Which he didn't hear before, by the way. Did you notice he was very nervous? He had no idea where I was going.
Well, first, too, I do want to make a comment. Mr. Kareem, you had mentioned that education is the gateway out of poverty, and as Chairman Manchun mentioned, I do have roots here in Trinidad. It has been 30 years since I've been back to the island. I came with my father, who grew up in San Fernando, very poor, but he had, and he knew he had a bright mind. He did not fall victim to the thinking that since he was poor, he could not work his way out. He made the choice and made tremendous sacrifice and a big gamble to, he excelled in school. He decided to attend university in the United States in Alabama, got interested in biology and chemistry, and knew that he wanted to become a doctor. And he graduated at the top of his class in Alabama, went to medical school in Loma Linda University, and I stand before you as a second generation who has inherited that privilege. He made a good life for himself, provided a life for my older brother and my younger sister, who and taught to us the value of education. My older brother followed in his footsteps, and my father practiced as a pediatrician in Los Angeles for many decades. He was well respected and well loved in the Los Angeles community. My older brothers followed in his footsteps as a medical doctor. My younger sister is a teacher in Los Angeles, and we all know and understand that value of education. And I'm appreciative that he did not, minister, fall victim to the mentality that he is a victim of his circumstances. And it was a personal lesson to me that I am not a victim, that all choices I make are my responsibility. If I want to improve my life, I am the one that will make those choices and take responsibilities for those choices. And I think that's part of the principles that we're talking about. Now, Dr. Menny, I'm going to ask you this question as well. We talked and you mentioned principles. What do you mean when we talk about principles? It would be good to define that.
By principles, I mean two things. Laws of nature and also fundamental truths. Those two things are similar. In fact, in your packet, there is a list that I keep of fundamental truths. First, let me talk about laws of nature. The best example of a law of nature, of course, is the law of gravity. What's the story with the law of gravity? Well, all the laws of nature have the following properties. They are timeless, meaning gravity works in the morning, at noon, at night. The laws of nature are universal. They work in Trinidad, they work in Tobago, they work in Pittsburgh, they even work in California, PA. Okay? Laws of nature exist outside of us. Can you imagine Congress passing a measure to repeal the law of gravity? It might actually happen in America. Our Congress right now in America has an approval rating of less than 12%. So it might be something they would try, actually. Okay? It's preposterous that humans could repeal the law of gravity because we didn't make it. It exists outside of us. Okay? So the thing about the laws of nature is that once you accept that they are there, you can actually guide your life. You'll know that not to step off of tall buildings. And if you step off a tall building thinking that you can fly, you'll have just a couple seconds to regret your ignorance, because you cannot. And the other thing about laws of nature is that there are no exceptions. It doesn't matter whether you like it, don't like it, know about it, or don't know about it. All things fall to the earth under the influence of gravity. That's an example of a law of nature. But what about a fundamental truth? Well, a fundamental truth is like a law of nature, except there are exceptions. The first example that I developed a number of years ago: multiple disappointments lead to a loss of trust. If someone says that they're going to do something, they're going to show up at your house or pick you up and take you to the airport or help you when you're having a problem, and they don't show up, you'll be disappointed. If they have a good excuse, you'll try to be understanding. But if a person does that repeatedly, promises they're going to do something, and then doesn't do it, it won't be long before you won't believe anything they say.
In fact, Dr. Armenti, would we not agree that that principle, that multiple disappointments lead to loss of trust, it does not matter the culture, the political affiliation, the race, the creed, the religion, that would apply universally?
I would say that there's only one I agree completely. But unlike gravity, where all objects fall to the earth, you could have one person. In fact, I can think of one. Do you read Peanuts here in the comics? Okay. Is not Charlie Brown an exception? He keeps thinking the football's going to be there when he goes to kick it, even though Lucy pulls it away every damn time. Okay? So he would be the only exception who does not lose trust in spite of multiple disappointments. So that's the difference between a law of nature where there are no exceptions, and Charlie Brown could very well be the exception to that one. This second one, I didn't believe it when I first saw it. To feel understood is the psychological equivalent of air. Not to be understood, not to have your problem solved, but to feel that another human being understands how you feel is the psychological equivalent of air. What's that mean? If you are denied air, if you're denied oxygen, you suffocate. There can be no worse agony than that, I would think. I'm claustrophobic, okay? So the thought of not being able to breathe terrifies me, okay? This statement asserts that when a person does not feel understood, they suffocate psychologically. That's got to be a terrible feeling. We've all had it. If you've had a disagreement, an argument with somebody close to you, your significant other, a loved one, it's demoralizing if that person doesn't understand how you feel, you've done it, you've seen it, people argue right past each other. So when a person does not feel understood, it's like they're suffocating. It's a terrible thing.
Might I add to that?
Yes, please.
That concept is not only between individuals. We also see that as a societal issue. We've all heard and experienced and watched before our eyes all that is going on in what has been called the Arab Spring. The whole revolution in the Middle East came because of a violation of this principle, because there was a lack of understanding. There was built up and pent up frustration as a society. And I think you all here in Trinidad can feel and sense some of that frustration. Is that correct? Within the society? We as societies as well, when we do not feel understood. These cultures, even at the cost of their life in which they're willing to give, seek to be understood.
And hold on, I think you're right, Ron. How about this third one? The only person you can change is yourself. Is there anybody in this room who believes that you can change another person?
Well, my wife's not in this room, so.
Anybody who believes as an adult that they can change another person will have the bruises on their face. Not literally. You cannot change another person. The only person you can change is yourself. And now, that doesn't mean other people cannot change. They can, if they choose to. So, I think that's that's an example of a fundamental truth. People change when they decide to change. How about this one? We think we see the world the way it is. In fact, we see the world the way we are. That one is huge. I was trained as a physicist, so in my youth, I was convinced, even before I studied physics, I was convinced I saw the world the way it is. And I would say, what's wrong with you? Look at this. All right? And people argue right past each other. And it wasn't until I studied the idea of a paradigm, a mental map. And I think most people now recognize that every one of us sees the world through a pair of eyeglasses that are invisible to us. Each of our paradigms comes from the accumulated experiences of our lives. Where we were born, what kind of a family we were born to, what we heard from our parents when we were little, what we heard from our teachers, what we heard from our friends, what our society taught us. And we basically filter everything through that particular paradigm. And since no two people have the same paradigm, because no two people have the same experience, even identical twins aren't together all the time. I'm sure their paradigms are very similar, but maybe they had different friends, for example, and they would see some things slightly differently. That idea that we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are, takes some getting used to. But if you think about it deeply, you'll realize that two people can look at the same set of facts and draw completely different conclusions. I suppose the folks in Trinidad followed the O.J. trial in the United States. You get our TV, right? I feel sorry for you. Some of those channels are not good. But in any case, you may know that at the time of the O.J. trial, about 85% of white folks were convinced that he was guilty. About 85% of black folks were convinced that he was innocent. And at first, there was no explanation for how people looking at the same, right, they all watched the trial, they heard the evidence and so on, how people could draw two totally different conclusions. And gradually, it became clear that that was the best example of this. We think we see the world the way it is. In fact, we see the world the way we are. You may recall that the district attorney at that time, his name was Gil Garcetti, and O.J. lived in a very expensive neighborhood. Most of his neighbors were rich white folks.
Doc, maybe we should mention, just for clarification, this is O.J. Simpson, ex-NFL player for the Buffalo Bills.
I think they knew who O.J. was. A show of hands. A show of hands. How many of you knew who I was talking about when I said O.J. trial? I rest my case. The power of TV. Okay. Gil Garcetti, this was right after the Rodney King. How many of you heard of Rodney King before? It's a global community we live in, okay? It's like a small village. Okay. Well, you recall, after the Rodney King thing, there were riots. Gil Garcetti decided to move the trial from Brentwood, where O.J. would have been, his peers would have been his rich white neighbors, and they moved it to downtown L.A., where you had a different arrangement, right? It was much more diverse. Do you remember, how many of you heard of Johnny Cochran? Okay. What was Johnny Cochran's defense theory? Huh? Couldn't trust the police, right? Right? If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. What was going on there? It's really very, very simple. To the average white person in America, the police are your friend. They protect you from bad people. They help you out if you lock your keys in your car, right? Protect and serve. To the average person of color in America, what's their experience with the police? The police plant evidence, arrest the wrong people, are known to be crooked themselves. So, to a largely black and Hispanic jury, they could believe that the police might plant evidence. They could believe that, right? It's very, very simple. So there's a simple explanation for those polling results. We think we see the world the way it is. No, we don't. We see the world through our own paradigm. And for that particular jury, it wouldn't surprise them. That doesn't mean that the police necessarily did it, but it would not surprise them if, in fact, the police had planted evidence, because that was their experience.
So, Dr.